Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you happen to choose to deal with Corona Devotion number 2. This is going to be a short devotion and it turned into be longer than the sermon. So feel free to take a break and watch these when they work for you. And if you don't want to watch me, I understand that. But I would encourage you to listen to the devotional, this long devotional. Our last study examined Jesus as a prophet as he entered into Jerusalem in what we call the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday, with crowds shouting and cheering and everyone having a great time with their somewhat false expectations of what the Messiah was going to do for them. His actions and his words were those of a prophet also. He came as a king and he was a priest, but he was acting as a prophet also. He predicted that the temple would be destroyed, and as we know, in 70 AD and again in 135 AD, the temple was destroyed. He wept as he predicted the slaughter of so many people as it would take place in the future, as he was predicting it. It all could have been avoided had the nation of Israel simply understood the event of his triumphal entry, as he said, "You do not understand this visitation, this lesson." But they didn't, and they didn't follow him. As we know, the temple was destroyed, and it has not been utilized for worship, except for a very short period of time since. Many say that sacrificial worship took place in the temple up into 70 AD, but then it stopped. But there was a short period of time, and I think there's a lesson to be learned from this, a short period of time when a self-appointed Messiah named Bar Kokhba gained a large following, and by 132 had a sizable army, hundreds of thousands, who did take Jerusalem from Rome. Rome was controlled by Hadrian at the time, and Hadrian then moved against them and took Jerusalem back. But in that short period of time, they actually had some sacrifices that took place in the temple, some religious sacrifices by the priests that were appointed by Bar Kokhba. We know Hadrian as the king or the Caesar that built a wall in the UK to keep the Picts and the Celts out, as Rome had established a part of its kingdom there in the UK. And we also know him as here in Rome as the one who built a tomb for himself. It was built on the diagrams and the designs that Caesar Augustus built his tomb, which is just a few blocks from the church here. This tomb is not frequented by very many people, but you can walk by and see this brick building that's been standing there for over 2,000 years. And Hadrian wanted a temple similar to Caesar Augustus's. So he built a circular brick building for his body to be placed in. And later a castle was built around it. St. Angelo, Castle de San Angelo, or the St. Angelo's Castle, is his tomb, although I don't think he's buried there. Bar Kokhba appointed high priest, and sacrifices were made in Jerusalem for a short period of time during Hadrian's rule over Rome and the Middle East. Hadrian was able to squash the revolt, and in anger, and it seems he was extremely angry, he leveled the city. The city was taken to the ground, and then he rebuilt it again. He was the one who rebuilt it after the destruction in 70. He built it this time on Roman-style designs. And a few things that took place as a result of that, which is why I'm including this in our study. Not worship service, but study. One, Christians did not join the revolt. Many Jewish people did, but the Christians did not join in the revolt. And so they were spared the wrath of Hadrian. Perhaps they remembered the words of Jesus when he warned them of false messiahs, false prophets, showing up to say that they were the one. And Christians may have made the mistake that Jesus had come back, but they did not make that mistake. And so they were spared the terrible wrath of Hadrian, although Hadrian did not like Christians much. Within the design of the city, it was designed on Roman designs, and it was designed in quarters. And so if you were looking down on Jerusalem at that time from a bird's eye view, you'd have seen a cross. Interesting. He at that time made a distinction, Hadrian did. He made a distinction between the Jews and the Christians. There were other times when Christians and Jews were seen as different groups by the Roman government. But Hadrian saw them as different at this point because they had not joined in the rebellion. One of the things that Hadrian did was he did his best to eliminate sacred sites in Jerusalem. He did so in an attempt to eliminate both Christianity and Judaism. He did so by building pagan temples and shrines over the sites that were important to Christians and Jews. So later, when people came looking for these sites that would become important to Christianity, people like Constantine's mother, they were able to find them because there was a pagan temple or a pagan shrine on top of the place that Christians and Jews had revered. So this made it easier for them to find the place. And sadly, sometimes we make more of the places than we should. So back to the original story. Jesus acted out another prophetic action soon after the triumphal entry. It's recorded differently by Matthew and Mark, and the purpose of it being different is that Matthew tends to want to take the subject and simply move through the subject, and Mark tends to take things more from a chronological point of view. He's marking them out as they took place. In Matthew 21, starting with verse 18, Jesus cursed a fig tree. As he's on his way into Jerusalem, he sees a tree that has leaves on it, and this would be an indicator that the tree had fruit. He goes on to say in Matthew that it immediately withered or died. And that's the last we hear of the fig tree in Matthew. And that makes sense of Matthew simply trying to tell the story of the fig tree so that they would get the point of what Jesus had done. In Mark, it seems that Jesus cursed the fig tree on Monday, and passing by the tree on the next day, Tuesday, the disciples recognized the tree and they saw that it had withered from the roots. Both are making the same point. I don't think Matthew cared about the chronology, whereas Mark is laying out the chronology a little more specifically. We see that that's also true when they tell the story of the cleansing of the temple. It seems as if they're taking place at a different time. If you read Matthew as one who is writing things out chronologically, but he's not in this case. He's writing things out topically. So he covers a topic and moves to another topic without that much reference to the time, where Mark is making reference to the time in this case. There are times when Matthew does mark the time, but in this case, he's simply dealing with it topically. So some people are bothered by this, but it doesn't bother me, and many authors utilize time travel, if you want to call it that, but it's moving around of time. Many books move from different times, going back in time, going forward in time, and most movies today, it seems, they like to change the times. While watching a TV show or movie, we see the screen coming up with the phrase that states 2 years earlier or 3 months in the future. Kathy and I just watched a 6-part series that moved in time at least 2 times in each episode. We had to pay close attention to see if this was something that was taking place in New York or in Berlin, and that those are the 2 cities that were the settings for the scenes in this movie. And it moved back and forth at least a change or 2 every episode. So Matthew doesn't care so much about the time. He just takes the topic and he completes the topic, both in dealing with the cleansing of the temple as well as the cursing of the fig tree. both the cleansing of the temple and the cursing of the fig tree are actions on Jesus' part to convey a very, very important message that seemed to be missed by the people. Had they understood the message, had they understood his arrival in this triumphal entry that we celebrate as Palm Sunday, things might have been different, but they did not recognize his visitation. So on Monday, Jesus curses the fig tree. It immediately withers in Matthew. In Mark, he curses the fig tree on Monday, and Tuesday, the disciples see it again, and it's withered. Probably Mark's account is more exact in the time frame. The main point is Rome will destroy Jerusalem. And what Jesus proclaimed as he was weeping, that there would be ramps run up against the wall and against the city of Jerusalem, because Romans would enter into Jerusalem and slaughter people randomly. The cleansing of the temple was to say because the temple was impure because of what was going on, due to the lack of concern on the part of the people, but more importantly, the lack of concern for God's work by the leadership, and the leadership using the situation to steal money from the people. That's essentially what they were doing. They were using their power to steal money from people who wanted to come and worship in Jerusalem, to fulfill what God had told them to do. They were being robbed. And so God was going to insert his punishment upon Jerusalem because of what the leadership was doing. And in the picture of the fig tree, we have to understand what the fig tree meant to the people of Israel. One, the use of fig leaves was very important early on. Adam and Eve rejected God's leadership. They did not do what he wanted them to do. Instead, they decided to do what he told them not to do. And by eating of the fruit that was forbidden, they found themselves embarrassed and guilty by the fact that they were naked. Prior to that, they were naked and not ashamed. After that, they were naked and they were ashamed. God had to kill one of his precious animals to create coverings for them, perhaps more than one animal. Blood had to be shed. And there we have the picture of what is going to take place later in the week as Jesus made his triumphal entry. Later that week, Jesus would fall. He would die. He would die on the cross. After the fall, fig leaves were used to cover Adam and Eve. We found that they were found in abundance. Fig trees were found in abundance in the Middle East, and it was used as a staple and common food, something that was desired by the people. It was one of the 7 foods found and displayed to entice Israel to enter the Promised Land. When they came to Kadesh Barnea, Joshua wisely sent the spies in. Moses wanted them to enter in, and as these are sent in by Joshua and Moses, the spies spend some time in the Promised Land and come back with some examples of some fantastic food: wheat, barley, pomegranates, grapes, figs, olives, and honey were the 7 foods set out in Deuteronomy as Joshua is encouraging his second generation to enter into the Promised Land. He is reminding them of the 7 foods that will be staples, and figs are one of those staples. It was used by the prophets as a symbol of stability, financially and also militarily. They could find themselves under the fig tree, as if each home was going to have a fig tree. Great shade would be provided by the fig tree, and they could enjoy the fruit of the fig tree. And it's something that was sort of expected, that all would have a fig tree on their property, enjoying the shade, enjoying the beauty of the fig tree. And it's symbolized financial and social security for them. It was a place for them to study God's law and to meditate upon who they were as God's chosen people. It became a symbol of Israel, like the olive tree, like the grapevine, and as the palm branch did. Jeremiah used it as a picture as destruction. When Babylon came in, they were going to destroy the fig tree, and Israel would see themselves as the fig tree. It was a common fruit. It was a symbol for Israel. It was an indicator of good or bad times. If the fig tree was destroyed, bad times. If the fig trees were doing well, good times. And they were not all that high maintenance, a tree to take care of. In John chapter 1, Jesus told Nathanael, as they're involved in sort of an uncomfortable introduction, and that some are questioning whether anything good could come from Nazareth. He's talking to Nathanael, and he tells Nathanael that he saw him under a fig tree. And this was an idiomatic phrase that meant he saw him enjoying God's blessing under the fig tree, perhaps enjoying God's fruit supplied to him as one of God's people, studying the law, seeking the truth. We see this as a symbol of enjoying the good life. It would be considered the dolce vitae, meditating upon God's truth, recognizing you're part of God's family under the fig tree. It was a place to sit, meditate, and enjoy life. Jesus used it as a picture of the destruction by Rome, and that the fig tree was a symbol of the good life God wanted to give to the nation of Israel, and they were going to reject it. He warned them of the ramps. He warned them through the cleansing of the temple, a judgment upon the religious leadership, and then a judgment upon the entire nation as the fig tree was cursed. It was also a statement that no longer would it produce fruit. Now, there's a parable shared about the fig tree, and that one man wants to get rid of the fig tree that is not producing, and another man says, let's give it another chance. Let's give it another chance. And perhaps if it does become healthy and produce fruit, then we'll keep it. This parable shared in Matthew and also in Luke. The chance was going to be given. And in 70 AD, it was over. It was over. No longer would fruit be produced. Now, as I shared, there was an attempt by a false Messiah to lead Israel against Rome and to reestablish Jerusalem, to reestablish the temple, and hopefully he would become a leader much like David. But that didn't work. Bar Kokhba was killed. Hadrian was successful in stopping this coup. We see the prediction of Jesus was exact. We see that it was exact and accurate. Now, this action of cursing the fig tree has bothered a number of people. One commentator, whom I like for the most part, has a problem with miracles. So when he begins talking about miracles, I read it, but I write it off as that's just William. He doesn't understand that if God wants to do things, God can do whatever he wants. But he would have written it out. He would have eliminated it because he saw it as petty and selfish. He saw it as Jesus being frustrated because he wanted something to eat, and so he simply had the tree die. And it would have been petty. It's similar to some of the miracles described, the false miracles described in the false writings, the false gospels that were not included in the canon. But if you understand the meaning behind the cleansing of the temple, and if you understand the meaning behind Jesus cursing the fig tree, it does make sense. It does make sense in that Israel needed to be cleansed, and this parable of the fig tree being given one more chance. It fits perfectly. You have a parable explaining what's going to happen. God will give them some more time. Over 30 years. But eventually, the time will run out. The priesthood was not valid. If you were to be a priest, you had to come from the lineage of Levi or Levi, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And that priesthood had functioned for centuries for the nation of Israel. If you were to be from the high priesthood lineage, you had to be able to trace yourself back to Zadok from the time of David up until about 150 years before Jesus was born. Zadok was the family of the tribe of Levi that you had to be from if you were to be a high priest. And this was not true for those who were functioning in the high priesthood during the time of Jesus. Annas was the kingpin, or I like to call him the godfather of the high priesthood. He was dismissed in 17 from the high priesthood, which was unusual. It was like the papacy here in Italy up until Ratzinger resigned. If you were a pope, you were a pope for life. If you were a high priest, you were a high priest for life. The papacy followed the leadership of the high priesthood. But Annas was removed from his position of high priest, but he was not removed from his power over the high priesthood, and that everyone after he was removed was a member of his family. He had several sons and a son-in-law who served as high priests after he was removed from being the high priest, and Jesus had to deal with Annas during his trials, after he was arrested, before his crucifixion. So we see that Annas still had control, and we find in the ancient writings that he still had control, and by the fact that if you weren't related to him, you weren't to be a high priest. So there would be punishment enacted upon the temple because of the leadership. There would be punishment upon the people because they refused to follow God, but instead followed the false leadership of the high priesthood. What was supposed to take place was God could meet man in the temple. When one came over Mount Scopus or Mount of Olives, these are two mountains right next to each other, running north and south, as one made their way west from Jericho up the very steep hill, many kilometers up to the top, 3,000 feet plus over the top of these two mountains, coming from below sea level, climbing 3,000 plus feet. They would come up over this mountain, tired, weary, ready to see something new and different, and they would look across the Kidron Valley and see this beautiful temple made of white stones. Especially the tower would be visible, and that the tower above the Holy of Holies would rise up. It was white. Most of the time in Israel, the sun is out and the sun is bright. One would come over the hill, ready for his religious experience, would look over the top of the walls from this high vantage point of Mount Scopus or the Mount of Olives, and look to see God's temple, the place where man could meet God. Thanks to the high priest meeting him, they could meet with God directly one day out of the year. With all of the rituals that took place, there was an understanding that they were meeting with God and that prayers were being heard by God on the part of the people because the priests were there sending up the prayers with their rituals. They could hear from God. They could speak to God. The temple was a place to meet God. And Jesus was saying, no, you indeed have the leaves out. Here's this gorgeous temple. Not that God needed a temple, but the people needed a temple. And here to meet your need is this gorgeous temple white stones. It took Herod the Great for 50 years to remodel the temple and to create the temple that they were looking at. And as they came over the mountains, looked down across the Kidron Valley, they saw this temple that said, "You meet God here." And Jesus was saying, because they can't meet God here, because of the corruption that you've brought into the rituals, the corruption you've brought into the personnel, the corruption that takes place every festival when people are robbed while exchanging money and animals. Because of this corruption, it's over. Going back to the parable, there will be a time when things can be changed, but they weren't changed, and so Israel was destroyed by Rome. And we can see, as I've pointed out many times, you can go to the Forum and see this Arch of Triumph that was built in celebration of their victory over Israel. Thousands of people were brought back as slaves. The others that were left there were left destitute. Many, many, many died. Jesus prophetically proclaimed this was going to take place with word and with action. So, what do we learn from this? The tree was saying it was producing fruit, and it was not. One commentator said that if a tree was on the east side of or on the west side of the Kidron Valley, on the east side of the Jerusalem slope, that it might produce fruit early that would fall off, and leaves would be produced early. Normally, according to everything that I've read, the leaves would come out in late April, early May, as with the fruit. Later in September, the fruit would be produced also. Here we have it. Oftentimes, there's a false fruit that is produced. And there's a message saying that there is fruit when there's no fruit, but the fruit would have fallen off. And the fruit had fallen off. The nation of Israel was no longer producing the fruit the way God wanted them to. In Revelation, as John sees an action in his vision, the statements are made to the church at Ephesus because they had left their first love or lost their first love. There must be a change. And if they did not change and return to their first love, their lampstand could be taken. Jesus said, "I am the vine, you are the branches. My Father is the vine dresser, and he will cut off what is not bearing fruit." And in this case, Jesus is predicting that since there is no fruit, Israel will be cut off. Israel will no longer function as God wanted them to function. One of the greatest festivals of Israel, the city grew to 3 times its normal size. Ceremonies, traditions, teaching, people would be teaching out in the porticos, out around in the court of the Gentiles. All would be saying God can be found here. And yet there was no real fruit, because when God showed up, they didn't recognize him. We need to learn from their mistakes, that even if God is making plain and sure as to what his message is, we have to understand that message, and we have to act on that message. Things must be changed when God says something's wrong. Some would say that this particular pandemic or epidemic that's taking place is an evidence of God's statement of judgment against the world. God, I don't believe, acts the same way today with the world as he acted with Israel. Israel was his chosen nation, and there was to be the showcase of who he was and what he wanted to do for people. All that has changed. We see that changing in what Jesus is saying. No longer will you bear fruit. No longer are you going to be the focus, but now the church is the focus. I believe that we reap what we sow, whether we're believers or non-believers. God will indeed at times move in our lives specifically, but I don't want to step out and say God is specifically moving to inflict his punishment upon people with his infection. We reap what we sow. Life is difficult. Sin is in the world. And with that comes sin, its results, its illnesses, and eventually death. It's appointed for all of us to die, and then there's judgment. One way or the other, we're going to die. There is illness. There were times when Jesus indeed healed people from their illness. But eventually, even those that were healed, those that were raised from the dead, died. I think it's wise that we cherish our lives, that we make the right decisions to avoid death as long as possible. But at the same time, we need to resolve the fact in our minds, one day we will die. Hopefully not as a matter of punishment, as those did in Jerusalem in 70 and 135. But we will all die as a matter of the punishment of sin in our lives. But the great news, the fantastic news, in spite of the bad news, the fantastic news is that in Jesus, when we die physically, we still will live with him in eternity. We will know him and live within his mansion for eternity. So I realize this is a bit of a rambling teaching session rather than a sermon. Hopefully you found most of the topics to be of interest. I'll be sharing a few more before we come to our worship lesson. We'll be dealing with Christ's resurrection. In the meantime, we'll be looking at some other things that took place in this extremely important week between the triumphal entry, Jesus' arrest, his trials, his crucifixion, his death, his time in the tomb, and his resurrection. Let's pray. Father, we thank you. We thank you for another day of life, and we know that for many, this illness is going to end their lives. It will bring sadness to those who are part of their family and friends. We also know that we can live as those who are different, who do have hope. May we continue to live in you and maintain the hope that you offer to us. It may not make sense to the world. May we meditate upon your word. May we sit under our fig tree and study your words and understand who you are, so that we will indeed live as people of hope. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.